I echo our audience's pleasure in having you here, Vice President. Thank you so much. So we are here to talk about An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, the book and film that has just come up and follows up on the very famous film, An Inconvenient Truth, that the Vice President made in 2007. And I have questions from you, thank you, so I'm going to sprinkle those in throughout. But I wanted to start with a bit of a detour because it is Sunday in America, and we are talking about belief for the next couple of weeks. And though Sunday is not a significant day in every faith, it certainly is in some faith traditions, including the ones that you were raised in. And I came across an article from 2000 when you were running for president that talked about you as a spiritual seeker, the kind of varieties of faith that were represented by your family and your own explorations as an adult. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. Just, are you a believer at this point, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer. First of all, though, thank you, Alison, for doing this. I enjoyed the interview we did several years ago, and I was a big fan of Odyssey that you created. And I want to thank all the folks that make this the Chicago Humanities Festival such an amazing thing. How great this is for the city of Chicago, and congratulations to Philip Barr and his whole team and Rena Rinaldi. I also wanted to mention Patty Green. I'm a big fan of Southwest Airlines. We were swapping stories about the founder, Herb Kelleher, backstage. He's quite a character and became a good friend of mine. So yes, I do believe in a creator God. I was raised in the Protestant Christian tradition. My father was a Southern Baptist and my mother was a member of the Church of Christ. And we used to swap out Sunday by Sunday, going to his church and her church. And I think there may have been some kind of all politics is local factor involved in that because my dad was in politics. But I got a full dose and went to a school that had chapel every morning. And after college, after I came back from Vietnam, I actually went to Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I dropped out when we got to Greek, but I was working full time, but it was a valuable year. And there's a lot all of us could say about this topic, but since you've focused on belief as your theme, I was reading a story early this morning about some guy in Silicon Valley that's trying to create a new religion with an artificial intelligence, a godhead, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's just what we need. No, I believe that, I don't want to get too deeply into this because I'm bound to offend somebody. I believe that there is a motivating spirit and a form of consciousness ubiquitous throughout the universe, or the multiverse, as some of the physicists are telling us is likely now. But there you have it.
You wrote in Earth in the Balance, how can one walk humbly with nature's God while wreaking havoc on nature? So could you talk about the connection between your environmentalism and your spirituality?
Yeah, well, even after all of the lessons thrown at me that I had the opportunity to receive in my upbringing and in divinity school, one question never really came up until it came up in New Salem Missionary Baptist Church in Elmwood, Tennessee, during Sunday school, taught by a truck driver. And the question was, what is the purpose of life? And that truck driver, a lay preacher, answered that for me in a way that I found more profound than I'd heard anywhere else. He said the purpose of life is to glorify God. And that may mean different things to different people. But to me it means that people of faith are called upon to live our lives as best we can in ways that push us toward doing our best, be kind to others and all of that, but in the process to glorify the Creator. And if we are heaping contempt on God's creation and tearing it apart, initiating the sixth great extinction, underway not because of a collision between the Earth and an asteroid, but a collision with our industrial civilization as we presently organize it, then fouling the oceans, the weight of the plastic in the oceans will soon surpass the weight of the fish in the oceans, literally. Destruction of habitat, rainforests, coral reefs, wetlands, the list goes on. We're now putting every day 110 million tons of heat-trapping man-made global warming pollution into the sky, as if the sky is an open sewer for our dumping of all the gaseous waste of our civilization. That traps as much extra heat energy now every day as would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours. It's a big planet, but that's an awful lot of energy. Most of it goes into the oceans, and it's disrupting the water cycle, creating these enormous downpours, stronger hurricanes. You may have noticed a few in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Drying out the landscape and the vegetation and leading to much bigger fires, worst fires in history in California earlier this month. And 10 times as many people were killed in South Asia while we were focused on Houston properly, and Puerto Rico. By the way, don't forget Puerto Rico is part of the United States of America. Every night now on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. Even though the newscasters don't very often connect the dots, this is what the scientists have long warned us about. And we really have an obligation, moral, ethical, to respect the only home that we will ever have.
Right.
And I'm sorry to go on, but you pushed my button.
No, but I mean, this is the question I wanted to ask you, and then we'll show the trailer from the film for more apocalyptic delights.
There's good news too.
We will talk the good news. So you say that climate change, you've said this all along, and I mean, you've been talking about climate change well before 2007, since the 80s at least. But you say it should be a moral issue, not a political issue.
Yeah.
But it is a political issue. It is a bipartisan issue. So why is that? Why don't we, this is our home, it's our only home, this is our planet. Why don't we take this on as a moral issue?
Well, we're the only country in the world that has these persistent levels of climate denial. And it's important to recognize that. Every other country in the world, except Syria, which unfortunately the gates of hell have opened there, related to climate, we get into that if you want to. But we're the only country that has this weird artificial partisanship that's been created. We have a saying in Tennessee where I live that if you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you can be pretty sure it didn't get there by itself. And similarly, you can be pretty sure these levels of climate denial, and unique in the U.S., didn't happen spontaneously. The large carbon polluters have seen the rising awareness of this crisis as an existential threat to the future of their businesses. And they very consciously borrowed the playbook written by the tobacco companies years ago. You may recall, you're too young, Alison, but when the Surgeon General's report came out decades ago linking the smoking of cigarettes to lung cancer and other diseases, the tobacco companies hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them in front of cameras with a message on a teleprompter saying, "Hi, I'm a doctor, and there's absolutely no health problem related to smoking cigarettes." And they spent a huge amount of money. You can Google those old ads right now. They're still online. And they delayed for 40 years the translation of the scientific and medical consensus into appropriate public policy, and 100 million people died unnecessarily. The carbon polluters, not all of them, but a great many of them, have put hundreds of millions of dollars behind a conscious effort to intentionally confuse people into thinking the scientists are trying to scam us and that they're, creating this out of whole cloth. Unfortunately, part of their strategy has been to give huge amounts of campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures, mostly to one side, making it a kind of a political tribal issue. And anybody that departs from the false orthodoxy gets a primary opponent from the farther to the right, financed by the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, and others among the carbon polluters. Now, there are other factors involved. There is a philosophical school of thought associated with Ayn Rand, and we don't have time to go into this, but one of its exponents, a big lobbyist in Washington, put it succinctly. He said their mission is to shrink government down to the size where it can be drowned in the bathtub, so that corporations will not face any requirement that they not poison Flint, Michigan's water, or that they not use the skies as sewer, that they just do whatever the heck they want to do. And that philosophical movement has joined forces with the carbon polluters. And the final source of this denial is human nature, because all of us are vulnerable to putting off any thoughts about something that's painful to think about, and particularly when there's a small group out there that just flies into a rage if the subject of the climate crisis comes up. It's almost like a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic father who flies into a rage if the word alcohol is mentioned, and so the rest of the family just tiptoes around it without ever mentioning the elephant in the middle of the room. And I think that's one of the reasons why the news media doesn't really cover it. We just went through the third quadrennial presidential election in a row, 12 years worth, without one single question being asked in any of the presidential debates about the climate crisis. Tiptoeing around it. They don't want to make that little group angry. Meanwhile, we have to answer to the moral imperative, to our children, to our grandchildren, and again, I feel pretty strongly about this.
Let's take a quick look at the trailer from the new film. We'll play it up here, and then we can talk a little bit more about what's in it. So watching that, and I've watched the entire film and read this book, one of the questions someone asked jumped out at me, and it is a pretty simple one. Is it too late?
The scientists say no, it's not too late.
But we're not going to get out of this unscathed, right? I mean,
no, there are some, regrettably, there are some consequences we will have to continue living with and adapting to, and some of them will continue to worsen in the decades and in some cases centuries ahead. But we still have the ability to avoid the truly catastrophic civilization-ending consequences. And the next several decades will be a test of the courage and character of humanity. There's no question about that. But the solutions are now available. That's the good news. And in this book that is on sale outside. Can I see that cover? I'm just trying to remember what it it will give you a full account not only of the dangers that we face, but the solutions that are now available. And it's a handbook on how you can become an active citizen in helping to build the movement. our democracy's been hacked, and it was hacked before the Russians hacked it by big money. And there are a lot of reasons why democracy in America has become vulnerable to this kind of capture of manipulation. But the cure for it is grassroots activism. And hope, which is legitimate and real, is a motivating factor. There are three questions about this. Do we have to change? Yes, and this will tell you why. Can we change? And that's just as important, because if we have to change and we don't have the ability, that's, party on, that's a recipe for depression. But the good news is we really can change now. And the third most important question is, will we change? And the Paris Agreement was a truly historic breakthrough. And yes, President Trump announced that he wants the U.S. to withdraw. But I was worried that other countries might follow his lead. But that didn't happen. In fact, the next day, every other country in the world said, no, we're still in. And California and New York, lots of states and cities like Chicago, for example, said, we're still in.
The Water Reclamation Board says they're following the
Paris Agreement.
Paris
Absolutely.
Agreement at a local level. But
let me just finish briefly.
Yes.
Lots of cities decided to go 100% renewable. Thousands of businesses have decided to go 100% renewable. And legally, the first day the U.S. could actually withdraw from the Paris Agreement is the day after the next presidential election. If there is a new president, excuse me one moment. A new president could give 30 days notice and we're back in. And by the way, I don't want to offend any Republicans or Trump supporters here. Seriously, I really don't, because I don't want to add to the partisanship, but this is too important. And a lot of the Trump supporters I know, who are friends of mine, are saying, we'd like him to kind of dial it back a little bit.
But these are my questions. Yes, you say that because everyone else is stepping up and going forth with the Paris climate agreement, that's a great sign, but really that the leader of the free world, even in the film, there's these questions from developing nations. Why should we do this when the United States isn't putting any resources to this? And so again, it comes back to both what the political optics are, but also the moral charge that it does feel like really it doesn't matter if he walks away.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. We could move faster if we had leadership from the federal government. And the idea of proposing that we force taxpayers to subsidize dirty coal for even more than we already are is really insane. But we're going to win this regardless of what he tweets. This is now embedded in the business plans of the vast majority of companies. Investors are shifting assets toward renewables. For the last 7 years, on a global basis, investments in new generating capacity from renewables has far outstripped investments in more fossil fuels. Now, we still depend on fossil fuels for 80% of the world's energy, and they have a lot of money and a lot of political influence built up over the last century, and they're desperately trying to hold things back, but they cannot. Here in the U.S. last year, if you look at all of the new electricity generating capacity, 3/4 of it was from solar and wind. Virtually none, 0.2% was from coal. By the way, there's a famous big coal museum in Kentucky. They just switched to solar power. True story, because it's getting so much cheaper than other forms of electricity, and it's continuing to come down in cost. India, you referred to India as one of the ones. We give them their say, and it's easy to understand their argument. But 100 years ago, if we had had the option of skipping the pollution and going straight to cheaper solar and wind, we would have. And their people are really getting upset that they can't breathe the air in their cities, India, China, lots of other countries. And solar and wind create jobs. Solar jobs in the US are growing 17 times faster than all other jobs in the economy. Solar jobs and wind turbine technicians are the two fastest growing jobs, and then there's a fall off before you get to the rest.
I wanted to ask you, just stick with politics for a little bit, because in the book, I mean, so through your organization, you're kind of creating climate realists, right? People who can go out and do the slideshow you did in their way with their communities. It's an amazing, I mean, I think about really one of the big impediments to kind of taking this on as a moral issue is it's an enormity and it's hard to grasp, and so to educate people is a commendable thing. You know, the more we know, the more we can do. But you use the term in the book, climate deniers.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if, like, setting up climate deniers versus climate realists, and you said earlier it's important to note the climate deniers, does that set up another form of partisanship of us versus them?
Well, it's a fair question, and I will admit to feeling a lot of frustration sometimes with people who refuse to acknowledge what is so obvious. The scientific community has been all but unanimous, 99.9% in the latest survey of the peer-reviewed studies. And now there's a new participant in the debate, Mother Nature. Turns out she's pretty persuasive. And, you know, in Houston, not too many weeks ago, they had a once in 25,000 year event, 5 feet of rain. The amount of rain dumped on the U.S. by Hurricane Harvey was equal to 509 days worth of the full flow of Niagara Falls. 5 feet of water in Houston, Texas. This is not normal. And in the 2 years leading up to Hurricane Harvey, they had 7 major flood events before Harvey. 3 once in 500 year floods, 2 once in 1,000 year downpours, and then along came Hurricane Irma, and devastated parts of Florida, Key West, and once in 1,000 year downpours in parts of Florida. Then came Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rico, as I mentioned, is still devastated. 80% still don't have electricity, 30% still don't have drinking water. The fires in California, all over the world, these events. And I think that in light of the human tragedy, visited first of all, by the way, as Pope Francis reminds us insistently, on the poor. They're the ones that are the first victims, and we need to be aware of that.
I mean, that's interesting, but when you, in the wake of Houston, there's all these newspaper articles saying, well, the connection between this hurricane, this really incredibly volatile hurricane season we have, and climate change is not an easy one to make. You can talk about warming ocean waters and how that has an effect, but it's not that they're saying this has nothing to do with climate change, but it is, just as in faith, there are things that are not fully known, are not easily, you know, it's not black and white all the time.
Well, actually it kind of is. There's a distinction between linear cause and effect, one cause, one effect, and systemic cause and effect. When you have a complex system that causes many consequences, and then you radically disrupt and reorganize that complex system, all of the consequences are different. Every storm is different now because we're boiling the oceans and putting an enormous increase in water vapor into the sky. Warmer air holds more water vapor. Each degree increase is Celsius leads to a 7% increase in holding capacity. That's why you get these huge downpours, not only of rain, but in winter, snowpocalypse, snowmageddon, it melts in a few days, but we get these huge downpours. And average humidity worldwide has increased 5% in the last 30 years. We're creating, you know, we have a collision between industrial civilization as it's presently organized and the Earth's ecological system. And there are many manifestations of it. but by far the most serious is the global warming problem. The sky is more vulnerable than any of the other load-bearing parts of this ecological system because it's so thin. When you walk outside after this event, the sky looks like a vast and limitless expanse. It's in reality a very thin shell around the planet. If you could drive a car at normal speed straight up in the air, you'd get to the top of the breathable atmosphere in just 5 minutes. And we're using it as an open sewer, and we have to stop doing that.
So let's get to some of the solutions, because yeah, there's a big chunk of this book that is about actions you can take, all kinds of them. But we have a question: what is the most effective way to discuss climate change reality without sounding extremist to the typical denier, climate denier?
Well, first of all, give them the gift of your attention and let them feel as if they're being heard. Ask them what part of the scientific consensus troubles you, and then try to zero in on that particular part. Now, I'll have to say with some, you get the feeling that they're reading off an internal teleprompter from Fox News, and maybe they're not willing to listen to you, in which case be kind and say, well, I've enjoyed talking with you. And try to direct your efforts at those who are willing to listen. There are a lot of really good people who have been fed this propaganda, again, financed by the carbon polluters. And we are making headway, by the way. You mentioned Houston. I was back in Houston last week. There have been a number of studies down there. People who used to deny the climate crisis are now saying, well, you know what, I think we're going to have to do something about this. It really is beginning to change significantly.
All politics really is local.
Yeah, yes. And unfortunately, these extreme events connected to climate are getting much more destructive and much more frequent. We've had 14 once-in-a-thousand-year downpours in the U.S. in the last 7 years. You're not supposed to have a once-in-a-thousand-year event every 6 months. You're just not supposed to.
Here's another question. Given the Pruitt, head of the EPA, and Trump leadership, how is your initiative addressing these politics, especially in this blue state? So I guess the question is, what actual impact is what you're doing going to have on those kinds of politics?
Well, I think we have to work around them. And we have some resilience in the American system. Courts have blocked some of the things they're trying to do. The Congress refused to go along with their methane rule. I won't go into the details of that. There are now 30 Republican members of the House of Representatives who have switched sides and are part of the Climate Solutions Caucus. There are a number of Republican senators who are now trying to find a way to get off the end of that limb. We're not that far from a working majority. But as for Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt, I tried to convince Donald Trump. I had many conversations with him after the election, after he went into the White House, and I thought he would come to his senses, but I was wrong. And Pruitt, of course, is, you know, he's a, I'm trying to avoid some pejorative term here, but he has been wholly and completely sympathetic with the polluters for his entire career, and he's continuing on that course. So there's zero chance, in my opinion, of changing their minds. Maybe somebody else can. I have not been able to.
Yeah, you know, in An Inconvenient Truth, a lot of the film is about the Bush administration and their attitude
The first movie.
Yeah, in An Inconvenient Truth, not in the Inconvenient Sequel. Their attitude towards science, it was an anti-science White House. They're rolling back and are not taking action on all of this, not making climate change a priority.
Right.
You've also been critical of the Obama administration in certain ways.
In the first term, I didn't think they moved fast enough. In the second term, I thought he did an amazing job.
He came around, but things like drilling in the Arctic, I think there were some ideas that you were like, well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it does seem...
And he changed on that.
Yeah. So, but it does seem like this is an issue that goes beyond the current administration, and we've seen it before, and we see that even people that do things that might not be good do things that are good. So should we take hope from that? I mean, is Trump and this administration far worse than what we've seen before, or can we say, oh, we've been here before?
You think? Yeah, you know, with the Trump administration, I don't want to offend, but when a new outrage comes along, as it does sometimes more than once a day, I have to download some existing outrage to make room for the new. And sometimes I actually think that the constant full-on assault on reason is one of the reasons why people feel just taken aback, shock and awe, paralysis. But we have to get over that. And let's be candid about this, or I'm going to give you my opinion. Our democracy is itself facing a crisis. The United States of America rose to be the preeminent nation in the community of nations because of our Constitution and the brilliant design of our founders. But it was in an age when the dominant medium of communication was the printing press, and that created an information ecosystem that gave each individual the ability to use facts and reason and intelligent discourse to try to persuade others. And that's what the constitutional design was based on. When electronic communication came along in the last half of the last century, and when television became dominant in the last third of the last century, it displaced the information ecosystem of the printing press. And all of a sudden there were gatekeepers, and if Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense in 1776, and it became the Harry Potter of the late 18th century, if he had a 2-hour videotape today and went to the nearest station or to Comcast or whoever and said, when do I go on? Well, he doesn't go on because there's a gatekeeper charging millions of dollars. And by and large, corporations are the ones who can pay that gatekeeper and very wealthy individuals. And as a result, we have hollowed out the public square of voices other than special interested voices. We used to be able to harvest the wisdom of crowds. That's how the U.S. made intelligent decisions more than any other country. But now we've started long since making really dumb decisions. Invading a country that didn't attack us, and saying these subprime mortgages are just fine.
Right.
And the list goes on, saying that you can dump cancer-causing chemicals into the drinking water, and that's not a problem if kids' brains are damaged. I mean, that's really awful stuff. So we have to recognize that it's not just down to increased skill on the part of individual citizens in framing their arguments in a cleverer way. We have to take on the role of big money in politics and insist that citizens be able to get back into the discussion. I do think that there is a systemic solution to this that may become available to us, just as the broadcasting displaced the printing press. The internet, even with all of its problems, is now displacing broadcast. And if we fix the echo chambers and fake news and the other problems, and there are solutions, this once again gives the ability to individuals to use ideas as best evidence. Bloggers are now beginning to have an impact. Every reform movement lives and breathes on the internet. There are now movements that are focused on saving our democracy. The Indivisible movement is a great example of a movement that empowers people to connect up on the internet, but then to connect up for real in groups of actual live people and petition the government and tell politicians that the power ultimately still resides with the voters if we are willing to exercise it, and there's strength in numbers. One other thing, if I could, I know I'm going on too long, but this is the Humanities Festival, and I want to put this idea out there. There was a great school of philosophy call the Frankfurt School in Germany. And after World War II, many of them had escaped to the U.S. and went back. One of the founders, a philosopher named Theodor Adorno, did a philosophical autopsy of the Third Reich. And he said the first step on the descent into hell in Germany was when, and these are his words, all questions of truth were converted into questions of power. And that conversion, he said, doesn't that resonate with what's going on today? And he said that conversion attacks the very distinction between what is true and what is false. Questions of truth should not be questions of power. Truth should be determined as best we are capable of doing it by the masses of the literate in free discourse, testing evidence in argument and debate, and then coming up with what most of us can agree is more likely to be true than not. If some special interest or their political handmaiden comes in with a ton of money to keep repeating a lie over and over and over again, that power should not be allowed to convert truth, to convert falsehood into truth, to make questions of truth questions of power. We now have the ability to take that on. And one more quote, 100 years ago this year, World War II, the U.S. went into World War I. And after that war, 97 years ago, the great poet William Butler Yeats wrote famous lines you've all heard. The best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity the sinner cannot hold. That condition is dispiriting and has characterized times in the past, but not always. We have the ability to rise above our limitations, and the best can be full of passionate intensity and take back control of the United States of America.
I love that you're using the humanities as our launching pad to do that. Poetry, philosophy, those are our tools in this fight. You know, there is a kind of an anti-intellectual strain in American culture. There's a long history of this, a lot of writing about this, and certainly you got caught up in it as a candidate, as a political figure, you know. Oh, you're a policy wonk or an egghead, you know, that was something you had to deal with. And you are intelligent, you are smart, and what's wrong with that? I mean, you know a lot, a ton. You got the facts, man. But I kind of wondered about that, what role that plays in all of that, and I think you just, in climate, you know, and in denying the reality that we're all facing, that we have felt so strongly this fall, you demonstrated incredible character on behalf of democracy when you know, on principles, when the Supreme Court made their decision in 2000, you said, I accept this. This is final. Getting me in trouble. Okay, the Vice President. If Donald Trump had been on the other half of that hanging chad, would you have made the same decision?
Well, it's a fair question. I actually consulted the Constitution after the court's decision and found that there's no intermediate step between a final Supreme Court decision and violent revolution. I won't say I briefly considered the latter, but thank you for your kind words. But honestly, all I did was something reflected in Winston Churchill's famous quotation about the United States of America. He said the United States generally does the right thing after first exhausting every available alternative. That's really all I did. But let me circle back to your prefatory comment. And this is an important distinction in my mind. It is not just that we should focus on education, and we should be investing a lot more in public education and college, but we sometimes fail to spend enough time and attention on the conversation of democracy, because this concept I referred to earlier, the wisdom of crowds, James Surowiecki wrote a great book 20 years ago or so. It's been studied. When there is a group of people that have the ability to converse without friction and barriers and under norms and in a culture that values the effort to find what's likely to be true, any group can be way smarter than the smartest person in that group. And what's broken down in our democracy is the nature of that conversation. It's not just that people who spend time trying to get the facts aren't effective in communicating with those who are, spending time getting information from wacky sources. It's more that the way we talk among ourselves in this country about the collective decisions we have to make has been radically distorted. And the loudest voices with the most money put behind them dominate the conversation to the point where people feel powerless. I think this wave of populist authoritarianism, not just in the US, but in quite a few countries around the world, has systemic causes. And we have to find ways to use the new tools in social media and the internet-based forums to recreate this conversation of democracy in ways that allow us and empower us to search productively for the best decisions we can make collectively.
Well, I want to ask you a question.
This is probably the only crowd that would applaud a statement like that, so I very much
Just come back, it's kind of a repeated question, but it's one of the questions that we're asking a lot of our presenters over the next 2 weeks on the theme of belief, and it's like, what advice would you give someone about how to find common ground with people who hold differing beliefs than yours? Because I'm sure in this room there are many, many differing beliefs. So what advice were you given to make
Well, again,
that
I
happen?
think giving them the gift of your attention, being courteous, giving them the feeling and the reality that they're being heard, and try to focus in on what exactly the point of difference is. There are plenty of sources of information, by the way, that are readily available now. There's climatereality.org is the one that I sponsor, but there's a great site that began in Australia, now in the US, called Skeptical Science. That is really the Union of Concerned Scientists. There's no shortage of accurate information out there. And if the person you're conversing with is open to considering the facts, then make them available. And related to personal experience and what we've experienced, I mentioned these climate-related extreme events. They're happening all the time now. Chicago had that horrible heat wave in 2005 that was just absolutely devastating here. There are now, the heat itself is, the 16 of the 17 hottest years ever measured have been since 2001. The hottest of all was last year, the second hottest the year before, third hottest the year before that. At what point does it become so painfully obvious that we can draw upon reality as a source of authority in saying, look, we owe this to our kids to deal with this?
As a question from the audience, so we've been talking about the role of citizens, the role of political leaders in all of this here at home, but around the world. And this person says, well, won't the marketplace demand alternative non-carbon energy, example solar and wind, regardless of what the Trump administration does? So that there's this third, space, the market business. What do you say to that?
Well, yes, it will, and that's part of the good news. Like many of you, I've been astonished over the last few decades that some areas of technology behave differently than what I remembered in my childhood. Bicycles didn't get cheaper every year and better every year, but but smartphones did. Computer chips got twice as cheap every 2 years. The good news is that solar electricity and wind electricity and batteries and electric cars and LEDs and efficiency technologies are following that law of technology, that they get cheaper every year and better, and the economy is shifting toward that. We're in the early stages now of a worldwide sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. And it's powered by the new digital tools, including the Internet of Things and machine learning and artificial intelligence. And it's giving CEOs and executive teams the ability to manipulate atoms and molecules with the dexterity first used by computer and network companies manipulating bits of information. And it's leading to much higher levels of efficiency, lower emissions. Global emissions have stabilized now. They need to start coming down rapidly. But yes, the market is moving powerfully in this direction, but it's not moving fast enough on its own, partly because politicians have kept in place laws that put up artificial barriers to the new technologies. And I can give you lots of examples of that. But here's one. Taxpayers are now forced in the United States to give tax money to subsidize dirty fossil fuels that are destroying our future at a rate 26 times larger than the meager encouragements for renewable energy. On a global basis, it's 35 times larger subsidies for fossil fuels than for renewables. One of the easiest things we could do with government to accelerate the market shift that's underway is to get rid of all those subsidies for the dirty legacy fuels that are destroying the future of humanity. One other thing, since the Paris Agreement, again, truly an historic breakthrough, India, to pick that example, has done a U-turn. They closed 37 coal mines this year. They're blowing the roof off on solar installations, 175 gigawatts under construction and in the pipeline there now. They're getting bids less than half the cost for electricity from burning coal. They've even announced in India just 2 months ago that within only 13 years, 100% of all their new cars and trucks will have to be electric vehicles. They're now moving faster than we are. And this is happening in countries all around the world. Again, every nation is on this train that has left the station, except for Syria, and Trump is still in the caboose because he can't complete the departure until the end of this term.
Staying on track, do you think we're on track to meet those goals, like keep global temps below a 2-degree rise in the 21st century? There's also stuff about, preparing for climate change, but protecting our food source,
Yeah.
and then also making finance kind of align with these efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote climate resiliency. And we've talked a lot about that since Katrina in 2005.
Yeah, well, let me parse your question.
Yep.
We are on track to meet the goals signed up to at the Paris conference. The U.S., because of state, cities, businesses, and civic society, will meet and even exceed the goals that former President Obama helped establish in Paris. Yes. Those goals themselves are not enough, all taken together, to keep us below the 2-degree limit that scientists say we shouldn't exceed by way of increased temperatures. But next year will be the first 5-year review of the Paris Agreement, and they'll start it next year. And with the technology still coming down in cost, every nation is called upon to upgrade their commitments every 5 years. And that process, I think, does have a chance to keep us under 2 degrees and perhaps even meet the aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees of increase. So I do think that's definitely possible.
Are you going to be there? Will you be
Yes,
part of that?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll be at this year's Conference of the Parties in Bonn, Germany, just in a few weeks.
So I have a question as I wrap up our conversation. It's sad to let you go. We've enjoyed talking with you. You can stay. We're here all day.
Well, you have so many great presentations, and you got Walter Isaacson coming up later, so I don't want to encroach on his time.
Brooke Gladstone will be talking about reality as well. This person asks, what have you learned that's new over the decades that you've worked on this?
Well, there are two new things in the decade since the first book and movie, and we've talked about them both, but they're both startling. A big increase in the frequency and severity of climate-related extreme events. Secondly, we do have the solutions now. They're more available and getting cheaper all the time. They're beginning to be deployed. But there have been a lot of other things I've learned. You mentioned food a moment ago. The scientists have learned just in the last few years that the food crops we rely on are unfortunately very vulnerable to heat stress, and the extra CO2 levels alone are diminishing the nutrients in the food, making them more vulnerable to pests. They've learned that we're vulnerable to tropical diseases like Zika, spreading northward in our hemisphere as the climate conditions change. Air travel has a lot to do with that, but the climate conditions are shifting the balance between humans and microbes. There are more and more of these disturbing findings they didn't expect that they're coming up with. So it's kind of a race between the crisis getting worse more quickly than the scientists predicted, but the solutions being developed way faster than any of us dared hope they would. And the balance in the middle that determines the outcome of that race, I'm mixing metaphors here, but you understand what I'm saying, is the degree of political will that we can summon in the conversation of democracy to shift more quickly toward the solutions. And for those who worry that we don't have the political will to accomplish this, just remember that political will is itself a renewable resource. So get out there.
Thank you for leaving us with that message of hope.
Thank you, Alison.
We
Thank
can
you
still
all.
participate.